All right, we'll go ahead and kick things off. Again, welcome everyone. I want to thank everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Michael Higgs, Virtual Programs Manager here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. And on behalf of the CCI team, we appreciate you all taking time to learn and grow in community with us today. Today, I'm excited to be sharing space with Atif Rafiq. He's the author of a newly released book, Decision Sprint, the new way to innovate into the unknown and move from strategy to action. As many of you know, Conscious Capitalism is a global community of CEOs, presidents, founders, board members, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders from diverse industries, backgrounds, and perspectives who are committed to the shared purpose of elevating humanity through business. The organization was founded in 2008 as a 501c3, and it provides a community of provides our community of active operating leaders a platform to convene, participate in workshops, and interactive discussions with practical advice and tools on our principles and how they're integrated into different organizations across different industries. Our community of conscious capitalists offer best practices and business strategies on how the philosophy is applied to create sustainable success within one's business, leading to systemic change and impact in the world. At Conscious Capitalism, we do this by learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists throughout our Conscious Leader Network membership as partners with the organization and engagement with our local chapters. Several times a month, we do virtual gatherings like this as a way for the community to learn how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Little housekeeping. Today's session is going to run for about 45 minutes. Atif and I are going to be in conversation for about 25 to 35 of those minutes. And then we're going to transition to some audience questions during the remaining time of our session. Along the way, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during our time together. If for any reason you have any technical questions or issues, shoot us an email at info@consciouscapitalism.org. Now I am very excited to introduce you to Atif Rafiq. In this virtual gathering, Atif is going to guide us through his decision-making framework that helps businesses of every size and team members at every level get from point A to point B and harness that power that exists in each step of the process. He's also going to share some examples of how companies like Amazon, McDonald's, Volvo, MGM Resorts, these are all companies that Atif has spent executive or has been held executive roles or C-suite roles in. They've all benefited from the decision sprint process. And you're going to learn how you can too today as well. Atif Rafiq, he's blazed trails in Silicon Valley and Fortune 500 for over 25 years. After rising through digital native companies like Amazon, Yahoo, and AOL, Atif held C-suite roles at McDonald's, Volvo, and MGM Resorts. He oversaw thousands of employees as a global P&L transformation and innovation leader. He's built a very large following as one of today's top management thinkers. Over 500,000 people follow his ideas about management and leadership on LinkedIn, where he's a top voice, and his newsletter, Rewire, has over 100,000 subscribers. He's passionate about helping companies push boldly into the future, and he accomplishes this through his Ritual software. It's an app that's revolutionizing how teams innovate and problem solve. He's also a keynote speaker, a board member, and a CEO advisor. Atif, enough of the preamble there. Great to get into the conversation. Again, a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. I want to start with, you have a storied background both in Silicon Valley and then, as I mentioned in your bio, at Fortune 500 companies as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your shift from working in Silicon Valley to the Fortune 500 and how you brought those skills of Silicon Valley into all those new roles that you had in the Fortune 500?
Well, Michael, it's a pleasure to join you, first of all. And yeah, just to share a little bit about my transition from Silicon Valley to the C-suite of the Fortune 500. You know, this is a step I took about 10 years ago. It was one of those calculated bets that that paid off, quite frankly. And so sitting here in 2023, it's very kind of obvious that every company is influenced in some ways by technology and digitization. But 10 years ago, when I made the leap to be the first chief digital officer in the Fortune 500, that was not obvious. I got a call from the CEO of McDonald's, and he had a vision around how we could think differently about the consumer experience and really reinventing McDonald's attribute of convenience around the customer using technology. And that seemed like a bet worth taking, because you had a visionary CEO who would support you, and I could bring in some of the ingredients of Silicon Valley into this storied company. So that was the hypothesis of the whole thing. Of course, it was very hard work, because it was a cultural shock for me, going from, especially a place like Amazon, where ideas are, very common and people are open to ideas. The company is very comfortable getting into new spaces where in the beginning it doesn't know a lot at all, right? But it learns very quickly, and it figures out kind of a good way to kind of enter the market to organizations which are more about incremental change. So there was that kind of culture shock of, well, this is a big opportunity, but the challenge is going to be mainly cultural in terms of getting new ideas daylight so that they could go from potential to real impact. And that was my next 3 or 4 years of work there. And in fact, probably the next 10 or 11 years, I was kind of building my repertoire of how to get the elephants to dance.
Incredible. Yeah, I think you mentioned that Amazon has a policy, and it might be for brainstorming meetings. It's the 2 pizza policy.
Sure. I mean, Amazon has some storied practices. One of them involves 2 pizza teams, which is essentially keeping things non-bureaucratic. So if you're working on, an idea, you're typically going to have a team of 5 to 8 people. That's probably enough diversity of thought, which is important in solving problems. But it's not so bureaucratic where, you have so much input that you get stuck, right? And that's sort of one of the ways in which they try and get that sweet spot of not having blind spots, because you don't want 1 or 2 people kind of narrowly focused on something and missing inputs. That's important to avoid. That's a pitfall when it comes to problem solving and innovation. But at the same time, you need to keep it a little bit. You need to have a tight team that's kind of able to move quickly. So that's one of the practices around Amazon, and there are other important practices that other companies have learned from how Amazon goes about it, so to speak.
Yeah, I want to get into sort of the your journey in formulating your methodology, and I think, or very early in the book, you say the question I regret asking in a meeting is this an input meeting, or is this an output meeting? So diving in a little bit into your methodology, because I think one of the sort of cornerstones of it is innovating into the unknown. And I think that, in reading and greatly enjoying your book, I think the framework provides tremendous value across organizations. But I wanted to ask you, what exactly is upstreaming work? Because this is one of the pillars of your methodology.
Sure. Well, in the book, I coined the phrase upstream work because I think we're so focused and familiar with the downstream part. So downstream, I think people will be familiar with. It's really about execution. It's once decisions are made, especially large organizations are very good at execution around creating, a plan and executing on that plan, identifying the metrics and letting us know how it's going relative to those objectives and those metrics.
Sure.
We all know that before you can get to a decision point, teams spend weeks and months kind of collaborating, wrestling with a lot of ambiguity to develop their recommendations, drawing conclusions, trying to get alignment, being in a position where we can get to a decision point. And there can be buy-in, or there can be a yes or no. So that upstream work is really about the stage from a raw idea to a decision point and readiness for a decision. And that space has, occupies a lot of time, rightfully so, typically of cross-functional teams. And that's the process of sort of trying to identify the key unknowns, the key questions that should be looked into, getting to the bottom of those questions, developing some answers so we could start drawing some conclusions, identifying some recommendations, socializing those recommendations, getting stakeholders to nod their heads and say, yes, that makes sense. I agree with this direction. And then finally, what are the actions we need to take? So that whole body of work is not something companies should leave to chance or personalities. They should have a methodology for it. So I decided to coin the phrase upstream work to capture all of that.
Dynamite. You write in the book, nothing is more relevant for leaders of growth and innovation efforts than understanding if the right unknowns are surfaced, what was learned about them, and how the exploration of these issues impacts the plans on the table. So what are some of the typical pitfalls that companies face as they explore these unknowns on their path to innovation or problem solving? And how can they be avoided?
Well, I think companies have one of two reactions to unknowns. And typically one is we can be fearful of them. So we sort of water down our plans. So we go with the known items. Well, what do we know for, with a high degree of certainty, and let's build our plan around that. And that's a problem because some of the unknowns, which seemed a little bit, daunting, may not be, a big deal to overcome, quite frankly. And if we got into it and went a level or two deeper around those unknowns, we could get comfortable with them and we could have a bigger ambition. So the fear of unknowns does lead to watered down ideas and ambitions, which is not good, right? Because a couple of years from now, when we look back and we say, well, we did all this work, what did it yield? It's not going to have the impact. And from an employee experience standpoint, it's a little bit deflating, right? Because what happens is you did all that work and does the world care, right? So you have that component. Now, the other extreme of this, and I try to get companies towards the middle, but the other extreme would be being cavalier around unknowns, which is like, oh, well, we'll figure that out at some point. So we race ahead with something like building a prototype. And then a portion of the team builds this amazing prototype. Prototype is super cool. And then, we don't get the buy-in and the head nods in the company because there's still really important questions that are open and which we haven't convinced people around. And so if you kick the can down the road around the unknowns, then you could run into a situation where the project has fits and starts, where, like some people are in one camp and other people are in another camp. And so those are not good outcomes for employee experience or for the company. So we need something where we can take the unknowns and make them actionable. And so neither fear them nor be cavalier about them. And that's where I focus my work and why I introduce upstream work and a sort of a methodology to make unknowns actionable so you can get to a point where you could drive decision making and recommendations.
Wonderful. I'm just looking at the current macroeconomic environment. I don't think anyone can predict where we're going. You hear voices saying a mild recession, but I think that there's economic challenges for any business right now that's operating. One of the questions, there's certainly a lot as a result of that, a lot of belt tightening around budgets and such. How does that affect the work of innovation in companies, kind of given the current macro environment that we're in the midst of, all the uncertainty?
The uncertainty and the austerity, Michael, they basically raise the bar on innovation. And so you have this tension between the fact that companies, in my view, need innovation more than ever. Why do I say that? It's because, the only way to grow and produce results is by solving new problems, getting into new territory. You're probably going to have to wrestle with some things that your company is dealing with for the first time ever. So you've got to continually kind of forge through this kind of innovation. You need to innovate in order to stay relevant and produce the results. But at the same time, CEOs are asking hard questions like, What will the impact be? What are the results? How do I prioritize this relative to all the other things we can do? What are the trade-offs? So there's a lot more of a narrative needed around these ideas, and it needs to be a little more bulletproof in terms of the thinking behind it. And so what I recommend there is basically, what I'm seeing is basically a need for innovation rising to a higher bar and a higher velocity of innovation required within organizations. So it's a real sort of tightrope for teams, which is why we need a way to, and a method to get from A to B, which is take, a promising new idea and in a very concrete way, get to the point where we can put the right recommendations on the table and have people understand how we got from our raw idea to what we're recommending.
Certainly. And in the spirit of innovation, I think, at least for my generation, we all read The Innovator's Dilemma. We've heard of such things as design thinking, which was a very, very popular philosophical approach to innovation. And it's certainly been one of the bigger drivers of innovation within organizations over the last decade. You assert that doesn't provide an edge anymore for innovation. Why is that, and what new edge is required? How do we sharpen our knives?
Yeah, we've got to constantly sharpen, right? Because design thinking, I think I know for a fact, because I've been a proponent of it, has helped organizations tremendously, for about 15 years, maybe even 20 years, really was that spark we needed, where design thinking would help us stop talking and stop having meetings and start to put something on the table. Like, what does good look like? Really asking that question, and then simply putting it together as a mock-up, a prototype, or something like that, and that was so effective. I mean, I've done that with the board of directors of McDonald's, 10 years ago, where, there's a prototype, and guess what? $500 million of funding resulted after the meeting. So it did unlock a lot of value. People seeing is believing. People see the future and they want to support it. So we had that going on. That being said, design thinking is also something where it can be incomplete, because if you think about who can be involved in prototypes, for example, it's really specific roles in companies: product managers, designers, developers, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The kinds of problems we're solving today are more holistic. You need regulatory, legal, finance, you need operations. There are other kind of people who need to be included in the process of exploring these ideas and really getting to the sound recommendations that put the company in the right direction. And so we need a way that's beyond prototypes. So I'm recommending sort of a way of doing things like exploration that is more inclusive. Yeah, helps you get the right inputs in the company. If you pair that with prototypes, I think you're going to unlock a lot more change and transformation in your organization. So it's not that design thinking is over. It's just that it needs a complement that I think scales to more types of problems within companies. It doesn't have to be a consumer experience problem. It could be a supply chain problem, right? Sure. And it helps get the organization mobilized to problem solve almost anything. And that, I think, there's a lot of power in what I call exploration, which is a little bit different than a prototype.
Indeed, yeah. And one of the things you make this point numerous times throughout the book is just, again, that the notion of inclusivity, bringing together maybe disparate parts of the organization, running them through the various workflows that you offer in the book to sort of have that contribute to those inputs and really surface those unknowns. One thing that you write in the book is it's a tagline: calibration over control, and you say that's synonymous with your leadership track record. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, a lot of times people ask you when you show up or maybe give a talk, hey, what's your leadership style? And I think sometimes your style is a process of discovery. Like, you don't know it in advance, right? You have to reflect on it, or you get some feedback. And the feedback I often got was, you're just very different than all the other leaders, we work with. And I was like, hey, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't, what does that really mean? So I reflected on it, and I think it's because I do, try and put in place a different style, and it is more focused on calibration. And calibration is something that starts with listening, whereas control starts with telling. So in the
Mm,
control model, I think a lot of people understand it is, you show up, who's in charge. Let's say there's a single threaded leader, and everybody is kind of just ready to be an order taker. What does the leader want? Because maybe the leader knows best because they've been around for 30 years and that's how they got to that position. That's not my perspective at all, actually, because I think most of the things we do in companies, you know, um, we only have partial inputs. We have
mm,
instinct as leaders, but I'd rather go through a flow where I listen, I understand where teams are coming from, how they've thought about something, what
mhm,
they thought the problem to solve was to begin with, what questions they wrestled with, how they thought about the answers, what conclusions they came up with. Going through that flow is what I call calibration, because if you make small tweaks at each step, now you can actually navigate this fork in the road really, really well. And so I assume that I don't know best. I
mm,
I might know best after I have heard a lot, but I want to hear and listen. So calibration really starts with that listening process. But the goal of calibration is to actually be more precise in the direction and the strategy that we're going to pursue, which is an interactive process with the people you work with, even if you're in charge. So that's why I talk about that. It's also something that's more sustainable because everyone will understand how we got to that direction or strategy because it was an interactive conversation, if that makes sense. So it's more lasting. When you leave
mhm.
the room, people kind of get it and they can do their best work.
Wonderful. Thank you. You have a chapter in the book called Hacking Today or Hack Today's System. And I think you go through the 13 different types of gatherings, meetings, let's call them, in organizations. And those can be anything from brainstorming to kickoff meetings to executive reviews. Can you highlight, maybe dive a little bit into one or two examples of how someone might hack the current processes within their organization to improve and maybe align with your decision sprint process?
Sure. Well, I'm going to recommend two things. And before I do that, let's take some givens. Like every initiative may have a kickoff, and then the kickoff, they, clarify the purpose of the initiative, or let's say the problem they're trying to solve. Great, fantastic. And then they say, we have 4 to 6 weeks before we need to produce a deliverable, which is like this magic, amazing, awesome, strategy for the big wigs, right? Okay, so let's take those two things as a given, because that's not going to change in life, right? Um, it's really the stuff in the middle where I focus on the right workflows. So, for example, one of the very first hacks that I suggest for teams is basically allocating a period of time to simply source and collect the right questions. So giving the team members 3 or 4 days to independently suggest the key questions that need to be part of their exploration. And this is the first step of building an exploration, and simply having a great question list organized by subject matter and making that a deliverable before we know any answers, before we've drawn conclusions, before we have a recommendation, before we're saying, hey, this is the right way to go or wrong way to go, is really worth a ton of value, because it ensures you have fewer blind spots, and then you'll be drawing conclusions based on a high quality, fact base or reasoning base. So just a few days to collect and develop a great question list, I think, is the first hack. Let's say then you give teams a period of time and you distributed some work around getting to the bottom of these questions, developing like FAQs. The second
Yeah.
half would be to have a meeting where you're kind of looking at, a narrative or an FAQ around the exploration that you've done. Based on this exploration, what conclusions do we draw? This is very powerful, because when you hear a team coming to common conclusions, you know you're on the right track, and people believe in the work and the direction,
Mhm.
and is really going to stick. So the two hacks are basically sourcing questions and allocating a period of time to source questions as a discrete step. It's itself a deliverable. And then a bit later on, going through the process of saying, based on our exploration of these questions, what conclusions do we draw? If you do those two things, the likelihood of having blind spots is a lot lower, and the ability to defend your work and connect the dots between the recommendations you're going to make to the organization and how you got there, it's going to be a very strong dot that's connected.
Dynamite. And I think you share in the book that you innovated the notion of FAQs from your time at Amazon, where there was a requirement of a 6-page executive summary, and you had seen a number of people just sort of unable to complete these very comprehensive executive summaries. So as a result, you innovated the notion of the FAQ to bring teams together to sort of circle around these inputs and really dig into those unknowns.
Yeah, so taking a step back, any Amazonian is familiar with this narrative document that is very common in presenting, an update or an idea, number one, and the idea of FAQs, which is an Amazonian practice around, hey, if I need to kind of cut to the chase, and what are the 20 questions I'm going to be curious about, and what are some punchy, very well-researched answers that help me understand this initiative, and where I could actually get confident around it. So those are Amazonian practices. What I share in my book is some stories where I tried to bring that to other companies and it didn't work. Because you can't just tell somebody like, oh, here's an Amazon narrative about how we got into video, or how we got into pharmaceutical, or the prescriptions, for example, and say, oh, do this for McDonald's or Volvo or MGM Resorts and something else. So part of what I decided to do is really partly with the book, which some people describe as atomic habits for innovation, is break down this process into the bits and the workflow. So I think workflow is how anybody, any team in any company can go from a raw idea to actually producing this kind of quality of thinking and reasoning in all the raw data you need to produce a narrative or an FAQ. So I decided to make it a system for anybody, as opposed to saying, oh, here's an example, now you produce a wonderful narrative like you might find at Amazon.
Dynamite. And I just wanted, for our audience members, say in about 5 minutes or so, we'll transition to Q&A. So if you do have any questions for Atif, please drop those into the Q&A. Atif, one of the very interesting parts of the book I found is your forward thinking around AI. And obviously, I don't know if we're living in maybe a post-Chat GPT world yet, but AI and its implications, have been leading headlines for several months, the last 6 or 8 months or so. And you talk about in your book, in the current world and the notion of upstream work, it provides a certain visibility to new data and the performance of teams. What role do you see AI playing in the notion of upstream work for CEOs?
Well, I think the implications are profound, even though they might take some time to unfold. To go step by step, like if we take Gen AI specifically, I think that could speed up the velocity of innovation a lot, because Gen AI is good at essentially helping us learn things, to kind of speeding up everything from, coming up with the right questions to considerations when we're trying to answer a question, to even assembling a narrative if we give it a target sort of like template, for example. But just taking those one by one, if you gave a Gen AI a question list, like, oh, this is a problem we're trying to solve, we're trying to explore, here are some questions, it might suggest additional questions that kind of round out your exploration or the things you're going to explore. If you give Gen AI an answer to a question, it can actually critically look at it and say, you could use a data point here, or you're lacking evidence here, or your reasoning is like score is like below 50%. This stuff kind of doesn't exist yet in some productized way, but it's coming. And that's really my point. And then if you take the method I'm offering, the workflows, which again is like Atomic Habits for Innovation, and you say, okay, we did the workflow, now just export, a polished narrative with a structure, introduction, options, issues, conclusions, next steps, it can do that, right? It's going to get pretty close to that. So imagine the compression in like the preparation of content for meetings, right? You're not going to spend 2 days like, oh, we did all the work, but now we have to produce this amazing PowerPoint or this 5-pager, right? That's going to happen really quickly if you have the right workflow. So I think on the Gen AI side, it's going to streamline things and speed things up. But AI, of course, is bigger than just the language piece of it. So now if we look in the future at knowledge work itself, and we look at contribution, AI is going to give us very interesting patterns. So here's just one use case. You're going to look out in the future and you're going to see a situation where basically you're going to say, wow, this was a very successful project. Who contributed what? And it's not just people who maybe answered a question. It might be people who came up with the right questions, like the real critical questions that if we missed those, we would have pursued the wrong direction. And AI will be able to give us signals, give leaders signals on who's good at maybe asking the right questions. Maybe different people are good at answering questions and different people are good at drawing conclusions from information. Those are all great contributions in a team. And so now when you look at the composition of teams, AI may suggest for your next initiative who should be on it to begin with, which is not the standard, regular people, because this is your role in the company, but because behaviorally we need a little bit of skepticism, we need some optimism, we need some, some pragmatism, right? What's that makeup of a team? I think AI will help us determine that. That's just one example.
Dynamite. I want to sprinkle in a few questions from our audience here, and I want to lead with a question from Judy. You do a fantastic job in the book in sort of describing the overall, what I might call the pillars of the methodology, exploration, alignment, and then decision-making. How might you speak to kind of the methodology in a quick summary?
Yeah, the methodology is basically, there's the notion of upstream work and downstream work. And upstream work is helps you get from an objective or a raw idea to the point at which the organization can actually make decisions, yes or no, buy-in or not. So that's the main thing. And then within upstream work, the very first phase is building and running explorations. So I'm a big sort of proponent of exploration as a way to kind of really get to the bottom line of like, is this a good idea or not, or like what the strategy should be. And if you build and run high quality explorations, it unlocks the next phase, which is alignment, because in a company you do need alignment, right? Because there's no single person in charge typically, and that's not a good thing anyway. And then if you have alignment, you're ready to make decisions. So decision making is the third phase. So that's the overall sort of fabric of the book. And then it gets to 13 more detailed workflows, but those are more detailed, in terms of putting in place different type of interactions in your company. But that's the general kind of frame of the whole thing.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I'm going to jump to a question from Eric, and he asks, who are the thought leaders that most influence the development of the principles that underlie your book?
Well, certainly, you have Jeff Bezos because mainly because he's scaled a culture of problem solving, which I think is very hard. It's one thing to be in every meeting in every room, and then to be a very, a personality who can help people think. well, but it's another thing to scale that across thousands of employees where, they all bring a problem solving mentality to things. So I think that is really the reason why I believe a system is more important than the talent, because talent is not enough. You can take the same talent, put it in a dysfunctional system, and you're going to get lesser outcomes. You can take, good talent, put it in a great system, you're going to get, over indexing outcomes. So you need the system is always bigger than ideally than the talent piece of it. So I think he got that, he put that in place. I'd highlight a couple more people. You have the CEO of Volvo, who recently stepped down about 6 months ago, that ran the company for 10 years and is also a curious problem solver who was very, what I call, I actually call him in the book an upstream CEO, because basically he was there and always ready to engage you as a thought partner early on in the thinking and help calibrate a lot of the thought process. And once everybody sort of got clear and had that mind meld, he gave you a lot of trust to go do it. But it's really spending time with teams upstream, because a lot of CEOs, or too many CEOs, are very downstream focused. Well, what is the impact? What is the result? Well, by the time you're spending, time in meetings reviewing results, it's too late. You can't change things. So CEOs who spend time upstream are the ones who are going to have a higher probability of getting the results that they actually want. I think that Håkan Samuelsson, CEO of Volvo, is really I saw that a lot of that in action. So those are two people I would highlight. Of course, there are other sources of inspiration. I looked at Bridgewater and Ray Dalio. I never worked with him, but I researched some of their methodology. I tried to make that a little bit more, I would say, human-centric in my approach versus how they calculate it, because I don't think you can run a normal team like a hedge fund. I think it's just a very different cultural context. But the idea of decision-making systems is important at Bridgewater. I think every company needs one.
Wonderful. I want to take a question here from Kelly, and she asked, does your methodology lend itself more to a hybrid, in-person, or even remote teams?
I think that's a wonderful question, because, we have this tug of war today between, around hybrid work, right? And what is the purpose of coming to the office if I'm sitting in front of a camera that I can sit in front of at home, right? So I have a point of view that, what we do in the office needs to be, radically different. And I think that the purpose of coming into an office should be around what I call contribution days, which is really more team level sort of problem solving that's done better in person. But it's not something that happens every day, right? So as a result, when you continue to progress a project or an idea, right, I think a lot of that can happen, remotely. So the beauty of decision sprint is basically one reduces some meetings completely. And number two, because some of that work can be done just like, okay, here's your, in a workflow, everybody has 3 days to independently suggest questions. We don't need a meeting for that. You do that on your own time. And you stick to a timeline, right? So I think we can reduce the number of meetings. And then I think we can work more, more remote, because if you have a workflow, what you get out of that is, this is where we are, this is where we're going, this is where we have been, this is what comes next, this is what we're shooting for. So you understand the overall kind of progress timeline, so to speak. And that, I think, creates a sense, solves for some things where you can be remote, but still understand the big picture of where we're headed, which is a lot of what matters to employees. So the model actually tries to streamline things, be more, embrace the idea that there will be more remote work, but at the same time, make sure that when teams are actually together in person, that they're using it for the right purpose.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to ask you one final question. You share so many wonderful stories about your time at MGM Resorts and trying to solve an issue with key card entry into rooms. One of my favorite stories from the book is about the cryptic email that you received from Apple, and you title this section of the book, "Will you be my launch partner?" Can you share a couple lessons that you learned from that partnership? And just maybe set a little context about what the outreach, what Apple technology did this pertain to?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a lot of storied history around Apple's, secrecy, and I got to experience it firsthand when I was the CDO of McDonald's. And a team member calls me one day and says, Apple would like to meet with us, but here are the rules. I'll be in the top floor of the Four Seasons in Chicago, and the only people who could be there are you, the global CEO of McDonald's, and me, and we don't know what the meeting's about, but they'll tell us if we show up. And I say, okay, well, that's a little bit odd, but downtown Chicago is in our backyard, and it's Apple, so what the heck, let's go do it. So we show up to the meeting, and they have a black box, and there's something in the box, and it's a phone, which is still a prototype, and it's their first phone with NFC, so it's essentially Apple Pay. So that's the context is, we're doing this thing, it's Apple Pay, and do you want to dance with us? And if so, we have about 6 or 7 weeks to make it real in the restaurants, and that's not a long time to be able to say we've gone from 0 to 100% availability virtually of Apple Pay in the United States. That's a very fast timeline for most companies, and certainly a fast timeline for McDonald's, which is pretty deliberate around operational excellence and making sure things gets right. So it was a test to mix the cultures, and see if we could move at the same velocity as Apple, which obviously had a head start because they've been working on this for a long time. So fortunately, I tell the more details in the story and the book, but how the CEO and the key person we put on it, were able to kind of move at the same speed and pace as Apple to really problem solve, work through the kinks operationally, technically, marketing wise, and be ready and get our CEO on stage with Tim Cook, for Apple Pay and being a launch partner. So it was a great outcome, but it was, obviously not the normal Twitch, in a well-run company that's been around for 60 years like McDonald's, but we did it. So it proved that it is possible.
Wonderful. Well, Atif, I do want to respect your time. We've got about 2 more minutes on the clock. Again, a heartfelt thank you for joining us in our community today. Thank you for the stories, for the insightful, actionable, and informative content. I just want to give you an opportunity. How can people find out more about you, and maybe even sign up for the newsletter?
Yeah, sounds good. So decisionsprint.com is, introduces my book and some of the latest interviews like this, wonderful interviews with people like you, Michael, that I'm doing. So to spread the idea, I can be reached on LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, I'm pretty reachable there, so you can check me out there. My newsletter, if you search Rewire LinkedIn, you'll be able to subscribe. And then finally, Ritual.work is the name of my AI software company that is a team level app that helps teams innovate and problem solve, in a brand new way. So those are all ways to kind of take action based on some of the ideas here, if they're interesting. And the website and LinkedIn are best way to reach out if you have any questions.
Dynamite. And for our attendees, we will be providing a recording of the copy. And as you know, we have a follow-up email going out. So we'll be sure to include all of the links that Atif mentioned. Just as a final note, if you're new to Conscious Capitalism, check us out at consciouscapitalism.org. If you are an executive implementing conscious practices in your business, we invite you to join our emerging Conscious Leader Network. And on that, Atif, thank you so much for the time today. Delightful. And again, just really, really enjoyed the book. So it was a pleasure to chat.
Likewise, it's been my pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again.